Good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. So I just want to start off tonight by saying that I believe that arguably that we are living in one of the most evil time periods in the history of the world. Okay? We're definitely living in an unprecedented time of the slaughter of the innocents, right? We have over 73 million children every year slaughtered in the womb to abortion, the anti-sacrament of the diabolical. And I'd also argue that as far as church history goes, that we're living through one of the most confusing time periods, with many of our church leaders teaching things that are contrary to sacred scripture and sacred tradition. But I think all of us knew this prior to March 22nd, 2020. And this is when, quite frankly, something happened that I definitely was not prepared for. And I kind of pride myself on being prepared for anything that could possibly happen, but I wasn't in this case, right? I believe that everybody should have a 3-month supply of food and water, right, in case of an emergency. Some self-defense weapons, some medical things on hand, basic medical things. Bug-out bag if you have to leave home rapidly. I also believe that we should have a hard copy of at least a Bible, a couple of catechisms, right? Things like that. But I was definitely not prepared for March 22nd, 2020, when public masses, not only in this country, but throughout the whole world, were canceled. I don't know about you, but I didn't, in my wildest dreams, I didn't think that could ever happen. And it didn't happen in the history of the church. It happened in local places, but never in the history of the church. And take from that what you may. Was it a divine chastisement? Was it us, reaping what we have sown? I tend to think it's both and. Now, again, like I said, obviously there were periods in church history where the faithful had to go without the sacraments for a time, because either priests weren't available or there were times of persecution or war. But I honestly thought that with modern travel, that I would somehow be able to get my family to a place where we could have the sacraments. And I didn't. And I didn't know really what to do. And I think, like all of you, perhaps, and I won't speak for you, but my family and I turned to the YouTube masses, right? Our parish YouTube channel. We got up, we didn't miss a beat. We went from, the public celebration of the Mass right into when public masses were canceled. We had our YouTube channel up and running, and so that's what I did. Now, at first it was okay. The first 2 weeks or so, I was okay, making do, right? We did the best we could, my family and I. We set up an altar in front of the TV. We put a crucifix on it. We put some candles. We dressed as if we were attending Mass in person. We kept the same Mass times that we offer here at St. Philip's. But 3 weeks into this, I was honestly climbing my walls. I couldn't do it anymore. And so what do we do in this if we experience again a time in which we have limited access or no access to the Mass? And so what I did right off the bat, I looked into the time period where the Catholics survived under communist rule, right, during the 1900s. So I looked to see what they did. One of the very first books, it had just come out toward the end of 2019. It was a book by Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who's a bishop out in Kazakhstan, And the name of it is Christus Vincit. The actual title is Christ's Triumph Over the Darkness of the Age. And if you haven't read this book, I highly encourage you to read it. So in it, in the beginning of it, he specifically speaks about growing up under communist rule in the Soviet Union, and how his family and his local community kept the faith when they would only be able to see a priest on average about once a year. Okay? And so he said that families, what they would do is they would baptize their own children. That the community, they would exchange marriage vows with witnesses. And then when a Catholic priest would come to the village by night in secret, they'd take all the children and all the newly married couples, and the priest that would be there would give them the blessing of the church. But what really caught my attention of what he was saying was how he said his family kept the Sunday obligation. And so he was asked by Diane Montaigne, and again, if you haven't read this book, it's in a question and answer format. It was an interview. And so she asks him what his fondest memories were from his childhood. And I was really surprised. This is what he said. He said, "It was our family prayers on Sundays. We closed all the doors, we drew the curtains, and we knelt down. My parents with the 4 children. And we sanctified the day of the Lord because there was no priest, no mass. We had to sanctify the day of the Lord. So in the morning we prayed the rosary, a litany, prayers, and then we made our spiritual communion to unite ourselves spiritually with the Mass, which was being celebrated in some places at that time. And now, we didn't have the public celebration of the Mass, but there were private Masses that were going on every day in the church, right? Priests were still saying their daily Mass. So we could actually, what we're going to cover today, we could actually do this on a limited basis if we don't have access to the sacraments. But he goes on to say, the Mass, which was being celebrated in some place at that time at which we could not assist except in spirit. And we would invite the Lord to visit us, and we made the act of contrition. It was our Sunday worship as a family in the house, in the domestic church. End quote. This is beautiful, right? That his fondest memory as a child was this. This is how they handed on the faith. And truth be told, this is the way that the faith is supposed to be handed on within the family, right? Now, obviously not with Mass, but this is the way that it's supposed to be, okay? Now, one of the things that I especially want to draw out from what he said was that he said we had to sanctify the day of the Lord. You know, what does that mean? That means that Sunday has to look differently than every other day of the week. That the whole day is dedicated to God, right? Not just simply saying prayers or going to an actual Mass or an online Mass, right? So the whole day is set apart for the Lord. So the first thing that my wife and I did was we recommitted ourselves to make Sunday different from every other day of the week. You know, besides attending online Mass. We did this by doing no work for our jobs or around the home on Sunday, that it was a day for our family. Now, this was a great step for us, but it still didn't address the root of the problem, right? But my answer, though, was staring me straight in the face, but I didn't notice it yet. And so I continued to do some research. And so then I came across the incredible story of the Japanese people during the 15 and the 1600s. So St. Francis Xavier, he brought Christianity to Japan in 1549. And he was very successful in converting the Japanese. But just a very short time later, the Japanese rulers began to view the faith as a threat. and really outlaw it, right? And at first they simply banned the Jesuits and other foreign missionaries. But then in 1614, Christianity was completely outlawed, which bloody persecutions then followed. And these lasted all the way up to the early 1860s. And so tens of thousands of Catholics were dying for the faith. And many others went underground, and they became known as, and this is an official title, the Hidden Christians. But then in 1865, the borders begin to open back up to the foreigners, and there is a Catholic missionary priest by the name of Father Bernard Pettigee. And he was shocked to find that the faith had survived for all these years. You know, despite the bloody persecution of the church and the hundreds of years with no Catholic clergy, the Catholic faith had remained in Japan. So for over 250 years, the only sacraments that the Japanese had access to was marriage and baptism, like the same thing what Bishop Schneider said. But it had sustained. And so they asked the hidden Christians, what do you attribute to be able to hold on to the faith in your family for all these generations? And this is what, to a person, they said, that we sustained it by the gathering of the family and small communities gathering together, ready, for prayer and worship. And now it was here that something clicked for me. You know, I know Bishop Schneider basically said the same thing, but when I read prayer and worship as a community, I immediately thought of liturgy, right? And there's a well-known phrase in the church, it's lex orandi, lex credendi, right? Which literally means the law of prayer, so the way we worship, is the law of belief, okay? What we believe. And it's sometimes expanded to lex orandi, lex credendi, and lex vivendi. And this further draws out the implications of the truth that how we worship reflects what we believe, which then determines how we'll live. Okay? So I knew I was onto something now, because liturgical worship isn't simply an add-on for us Catholics. It is the very foundation of our Catholic identity. It expresses your and my ultimate and highest purpose, right? The worship of God. So worship reveals what we truly believe and how we view ourselves in relationship to God, to our neighbor, to one another, and the world in which we're sent forward to carry forward the redemptive mission of Jesus Christ. And so I started to research if there were actual liturgies for the home to do as a devotion, or for emergency situations like we were in, being locked out of Mass. And so the first thing that I came across was something called the Typica. Okay, it's spelled T-Y-P-I-C-A. And if you got a handout from the back, the very last paper that I gave you is a sample Typica. Okay? And so what the Typica is, it's a specific form of liturgy that mirrors the Divine Liturgy. Okay? So it's used when the priest isn't available because of a time of persecution or war, or simply if a worshiper is sick and can't go to Mass on Sunday, some kind of emergency. The Typica, it comes from the Eastern Catholic Church, okay, not the Eastern Orthodox, but the Eastern Catholic Church, which is in union with Rome. Specifically, it comes from the Byzantine Rite, which is the largest of all the Eastern rites, okay? So there are 6 rites that we have in the Catholic Church, okay? We have the Latin, or the Roman Rite, the West Syrian Rite, the Alexandrian Rite, the Chaldean Rite, the Armenian Rite, and then finally the Byzantine Rite, okay? So the Byzantine liturgy, this liturgy was developed by St. James, the cousin of Jesus, It was modified by St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom in the 300s. And so this liturgy is basically identical to the Eastern Orthodox liturgy. Okay? Now, why am I giving you this background? Simply because the Typica is a safe devotion for every single Catholic to be able to pray. Okay? Now again, the Typica, it's a specific form of liturgy that mirrors the divine liturgy. Right? And so now there are a couple of different Typicas. There is the priest's Typica, there is the deacon's Typica, and then there is something called the reader's Typica. Okay? And this is the one, the reader's Typica is what you have a copy of, and it's recommended that lay people do this as a devotion. Okay? And in the Eastern Rite, basically a reader is the same thing as a lector in the Roman Rite. Okay? So we use the reader's Typica when a priest isn't available for whatever reason. Okay? It's a beautiful liturgy. It can be prayed individually, it can be prayed with your family, or it can be prayed as a neighborhood, a small community. Okay? Now, it takes a little bit to get used to because it's a different rite, but you can easily figure it out. Okay? And again, the reader's Typica is highly encouraged as a lay devotion. Now, this got me thinking, though, that if the Eastern rites have a liturgy based on the divine liturgy, that lay people are encouraged to pray, then surely the Latin rite must have one as well. This, however, was a little less clear. Okay? So the closest thing at the time that I can find was the closest thing to the Typica that I could find in the Roman rite is the Missa Sicca. Okay? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Okay? Basically, it's Latin for dry mass. And this was a devotion that was used during the Middle Ages when priests didn't have access to bread and wine. Okay? So the Missa Sicca contains many of the elements of the Mass, except the parts that are relevant to the consecration of the Eucharist. And so a form of the Missa Sicca is still in use today by the Carthusians. Okay? They use this on a regular basis. All right? But this devotion kind of fell into disuse after the Middle Ages, so I couldn't find a ton of information on it. But in my research, I found very divided opinions on whether it was fitting for lay people to use the Missa Sicca. So there are two main reasons that I found why priests and bishops would kind of discourage use. And it was this. One reason was the concern that over time, this practice might run the risk of individuals adding elements that would too closely simulate the celebration of Holy Mass to the point where people would commit sin and incur an automatic censure. Okay? The other reason was it would lessen the people's desire to attend the holy sacrifice of the Mass in person. You know, kind of like those who are still watching YouTube Mass, right? That is what happens, right? We tell people that Mass isn't that important. I kind of like watching Mass in my living room in my pajamas, and so I'm going to stay doing that even when the bishop lifts, whatever, I forget what it's called. But anyway, now these two reasons make perfect sense, right? Human nature being what human nature is. But I didn't think there was any danger of this happening for my family. You know, for however long that we were going to be without the public celebration of the Mass. And so I made a prudential judgment. I thought it prudent to begin to implement this in my own home. Okay? And the only admonition that I could find, it read this. It said, a Missa Sicca is technically not a Mass, since a Mass requires a validly ordained priest to consecrate the elements of bread and wine. Thus, it should never be used as a substitute for Holy Mass, but merely as a lay devotion, which my family and I did. Okay, now this is all important. This is important because we don't want to be doing anything that the church either forbids or does not recommend. Okay, but here's the interesting thing. Now, I was justified because very early on, I started to find priests come out, and even in the diocese, and I forget the name of the diocese, they come out and they recommended the Missa Sicca for the lay faithful during the pandemic. Okay, but when I was doing this, I could only find a Missa Sicca from the traditional Latin Mass. And so I adapted it for my family. And what I did, I simply instituted, I took out the traditional lectionary and I put in, the current one that we use, the current calendar of the saints. And so after 5 weeks of YouTube masses, the Sousa family began to do the Missa Sicca pro Ecclesia Domestica, which translates to the dry mass for the domestic church. Okay? And I have to tell you, it was absolutely beautiful. It was ordered. I, as the priest of my home, the domestic church, led worship of God for my family. My wife and my daughter would do the readings and the psalm, and then I would proclaim the gospel. And I'd even give a little reflection on the readings. Now this comes with a really big warning, flashing sign, okay? This is fine to do a little reflection on the reading for your family, okay? Those that you have direct authority over, those that live in your home. But if you're gathering together as a community, there should be no reflection on the readings. And the reason being is that easily somebody can be teaching something contrary to the truths of faith, okay? And so if you do this with people outside of your wife and your children, omit any reflection on, the readings, okay? And what was neat for me was praying the upcoming readings for Sunday, praying with them during the week. What is God speaking to the universal church? And what is God speaking to my little family? And honestly, instead of perhaps growing lukewarm during the lockdown, my family and I were really growing in fervor. We were growing in hunger for the physical Eucharist, right? And one of the things that it really drew out for me was this. And this specifically, when other family members, when they felt safe to kind of come out of their home and come over to the house, we would do this as a family. And one of the beautiful things about this was not only the sense of camaraderie, with those that we were gathering with, but it was you were connected almost to those Catholics that came before us, that this is the way that they retained the faith in times of persecution of the church, right? And so, this is a safe devotion for all of us to pray. And I think it's important, not only in light of everything that's happened already, and like Keith mentioned at the outset, places like Canada, Australia, and other countries that can't go to Mass, right? They weren't able to go to Mass for Christmas. I just think it makes sense for all of us to be prepared for a worst case scenario. And again, you might have done something similar to this during the times that we were locked down, but I wasn't aware of anything like this that we could do. And so I've given you a handout, and we'll kind of go through those together. But before we do that, just kind of some helpful things to keep in mind. Okay, so one of the things that we did on that Sunday when we woke up that day, we made it all about that this was the Lord's Day. So we started immediately after, morning coffee or whatever, the morning bathroom trip. We'd start with family prayer, whether it be a rosary or a Divine Mercy chaplet, right? And then we'd go into getting ready for the dry mass, the liturgy. And we would do a very detailed examination of conscience. And I've included this in your packets, that the examination of conscience that I've given you in the packet is the best examination of conscience, bar none, that I've ever come across. And Father Ryan and I actually did our own for St. Philip's. For the adults and for the teens, this is even better than that one by a lot. And then what we would do is we would do an act of contrition. And I also included in your packets a perfect contrition. All right, so when we don't have access to the sacrament of confession, which we were very fortunate here at St. Philip's, that Father Frank and Father Philip always made themselves available for confession. But if there's ever a time when you don't have access, or if there's ever a time you don't have access for confession, the Church teaches that you can make or at least attempt to make a perfect contrition. And so what's the difference between a perfect and an imperfect contrition? An imperfect contrition is when we're sorry for our sins because we're afraid of punishment. A perfect contrition is when we are sorry for our sins for love of God. Right? That we love Him so much that we don't want to offend Him. And with all of the love that we can muster, we utter an act of contrition. Okay, and so my wife, now listen, this is a great practice. Before you get here to Mass a little early on Sunday, it's a great practice to do every time you're going to go to Mass. It's a great practice to do if you ever commit a mortal sin. Immediately stop. Muster up as much love as you can and ask God's forgiveness and say an act of contrition. Now, this never takes the place of confession. We always have to have the intention that as soon as we can get to confession, we will. Okay? So we have to have that, that desire, but this perfect contrition, it really is a beautiful devotion that we can have in our personal life. And this really leads us to, in this time period that we're in right now, mortal sin should be not even an option for us. That if we're still struggling with mortal sin, we literally need to cut it out now. And the most effective way to really do this is really whatever leads you to sin. We pray that in the act of contrition. Just cut it out. Whatever it is that leads you to sin, be honest with yourself, cut it out. Beg Our Lady's intercession. St. Joseph, very effective, right? So, a detailed examination of conscience. You have the Typica. You have the perfect contrition. There's also, on that same handout, there is the spiritual communal information on that as well. And then finally, I've included an outline of the Missa Sicca that actually I didn't do. I could give you a copy of my own, but I wanted to give you, this is from the Alcuin Institute, which falls under the diocese I was telling with. I think it's Oklahoma is the diocese that put this out. So I gave you that, and so it's safe for you to be able to do. And this really brings up some things that each of us need to have. It's not optional for us. And if anybody needs financially help, just let me know. Everybody should have a Bible, right? Everybody should have a couple of catechisms, right? The Baltimore Catechism, the 1992 Catechism, and the other universal catechism is the Council of Trent. I would have all three of those catechisms. Again, how we hand on the faith. If we're ever in a situation, we need the catechisms to do that, okay? A hard copy, yes?
Why three? Why not just the most recent?
Well, because there are simpler ways to say certain things like the Council of Trent, the Catechism of the Council of Trent is my personally favorite catechism. It makes things very, very simple. Okay? A child can understand it. Again, I like the Baltimore Catechism because I like the simple question and answer format of what's in there. The 92 Catechism is great, but not everybody can understand the 92 Catechism because you do have to have a little bit of philosophy and theology and understanding to really understand that 92 Catechism. Okay? Everybody needs to have a hard copy of a daily Roman Missal. God forbid the internet goes down. Okay, I have everything on my phone, my computer. But if we lose access to that, we should have hard copies of things. The other things that we should have in our home is at least a crucifix, some statues. And so this is what we would do with the Missa Sicca in our home. So we would set up, an altar. We'd have candles on the altar. We'd have a crucifix. We'd have a little stand like this for the readings. We'd have the daily Roman Missal so we could read from. And each of us had a copy of the Missa Sicca. We had some statues of the Blessed Virgin, St. Joseph. Some incense, if you can get some incense, to make it, to set apart from the rest of your home, that you're doing liturgy, you're doing something different. And all of the stuff that I just mentioned is everything that the church recommends. There isn't anything in there that is dangerous for us to usurp, the authority of the priest or anything like that. And so if you want to take out your Missa Sicca right now and kind of just look at it and see if you have any questions. Again, it's pretty straightforward on here. It's literally 4 pages long, and everything that you'll see in it is everything that you're used to praying in it. So there isn't anything here that is foreign, and what is omitted in here is anything that the priest does. And so you, as the priest of your home, would lead the liturgy. So take a look at it and see if you have any questions. Because what we'll do is I'll turn it over for general questions, and then perhaps we can break it into small groups. One of the things that I really highly recommend now, all of us, part of the Men of St. Joseph, we have a communication list, right? There should be other families that if we ever get into a time like that you're gathering with on Sunday. That you should come together for liturgy. If we can't get to Mass, you should share a meal together. This is how the church grew, was from the homes, right? This is what happened when the churches went underground besides the catacombs. This is how the church survived in Japan. This is how they survived for over 250 years without a priest. They gathered together in secret and they celebrated liturgy. They prayed together, they broke bread together, they celebrated together. And so that might be something else that when we break into small groups that you talk about as well. During the pandemic, there were, rightfully so, a lot of people concerned. But after week 3, week 4, I started, gathering with other people. We weren't supposed to, and I probably shouldn't put this on the internet, but I did. And I would do it again. If this happens again, I'm not going into quarantine. It ain't happening. Now, I pray that there'll be priests that would be willing to celebrate Mass like there were in the old days that we could get to. Hey, Keith, let the guys know that there's going to be a Mass at my house, something like that. But if not, worst case scenario, we have everything that we need, what I talked about tonight, to not only retain, not only survive, but really thrive through any period that really God allows us to live through. And I was caught a little unprepared that last time, but not anymore. So take a look at it. Any questions that you might have before I open it up for questions on anything? Yes?
You sensitive not to do a homily after the readings, if there are other people involved outside the family. Would it be wise, though, to have something like Word Among Us to read the day from Word Among Us?
Yeah, I think if you can get your hands on a Word Among Us or something like that, I think that would be great. Again, so this is a general warning. Now, many of you men of St. Joseph are equipped to give a little reflection on the readings without leading anybody astray or into heresy. I'm kind of saying what I'm saying right now for the general public, because oftentimes, and quite honestly, I've seen this before, a lot of well-meaning Catholics who've been Catholic for a long time, misapplying sacred scripture. It's not on purpose, but it's just, what happens. So I think something like, if you can get your hands on a Word Among Us, or a Bible commentary from one of the church fathers or something like that, I think that would be outstanding. That would be great. Again, I'm just trying to make this as cheap as possible. So when a dry mass is celebrated by the lay faithful, you'll never see, like a reflection or a homily in there. They omit that completely for the danger that leading people into error. But I think the Men of St. Joseph, if you have your hands on different commentaries, different resources, I think that would be totally sufficient to give a little reflection. Absolutely. Yes?
Good idea to have sacramentals like holy water in your home at all times.
Absolutely. Holy salt, holy water. No man of St. Joseph should be without holy water and holy salt, especially at this parish, because you can literally go to BJ's and get like 12 of those kosher salts and leave them in the sacristy for either Father Frank or Father Philip, who will give the proper blessing on it. So there's no excuse to not have holy salt and holy water. Great point. Yeah.
Page 3 to 4, you have the plus signs.
Yeah. That's the sign of the cross. Anyway, you see the sign, the little plus sign is the sign of the cross. And remember, as the Men of St. Joseph, you can bless your wife and your children. And you should be blessing your wife and your children already. But you can bless your wife and your children. Okay? Yes?
Most fortunate parish pastor kept it open. He would say at 7 o'clock in the night. The door was locked. We put whatever it is. As soon as he finished mass, the black doors, the church opened at 5 o'clock. And that was my refuge every day. So if we're shut down, we're not having public mass, we're still committed. We're not so persecuted. We still have the sacrament present.
Yeah, no doubt. So the Adoration Chapel here was open still. Father Frank kept this open 24 hours a day, and absolutely. Again, this is a worst case scenario that I wanted to be prepared for everybody to be prepared for. But yes, and here's the thing: if you can get to Mass, you need to get to Mass. If you can get to Mass, you need to get to Mass. This isn't a substitute for Mass. Okay? But
As at the end of this Mass, we will do a spiritual communion.
yeah, so right in here, if you look on page 4, right towards the bottom, it has the place for spiritual communion.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you mentioned wife and children, I wish I had a wife and children. Maybe everybody could put that on the plate.
I didn't hear a word you just said.
I said, when you mentioned wife and children,
Yes.
I know it's a stupid math.
Yeah.
I wish I had a wife and children.
Yeah,
Maybe everybody could put that on the plate.
absolutely. And again, you can do this. This is a private devotion too. You can do this on your own. You
Yeah.
don't have to, for the single or for a family or a gathering as a community.
Yeah.
Does this hold the same for family that's not with you, perhaps out of state or in a situation where they might not be doing this, but they still want to join. Like, basically, can we do this with my family here at my home, and also my family that's online, perhaps?
Yeah, there's no restrictions as far as that goes. So the question was, can we do this like on a FaceTime? Again, this is just a devotion. This isn't any like we can't simulate a mass. We can't start trying to bless bread and wine and hand that out, okay? Or get unconsecrated hosts that you go to Kavanaugh and you buy or you can go on Amazon and get unconsecrated hosts. We don't use anything like that we do not simulate a mass. Okay, that's very important. This is, you kind of stick to this, but how you do it, it's a lay devotion. So yeah, you can do it over FaceTime Live or Zoom or whatever. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Bill.
Did you still watch Mass afterwards?
Was that?
Did you still watch Mass afterwards initially?
No, I only watch the homilies.
Okay.
Yeah, I won't, well, I can't. It actually makes me sick if I see a Mass online because of what happened.
Okay, and the second question is there a general or speed of blessings for wife and kids, or is this
No. Yep. All right, so I think it makes sense. Again, one of the things that I highly encourage is having an idea of other families who would be willing to meet, who would be willing to have liturgy together if you didn't have access to the public celebration of Mass. So maybe a couple things that we can talk about in small group is, what did you do besides watching Mass online? How did you keep the Lord's Day? What was your experience during that time? And maybe, again, talking about different, a community that you could really kind of know that when crap hits the fan, I'm giving you a call and we're going to get together. And honestly, this is one of the most beautiful things about the Men of St. Joseph, that's really what one of the things of the Men of St. Joseph really is that I know that I can call on any of you, say, hey, Chuck, I'm having liturgy, want to come? That kind of stuff, okay?
Good luck with that.
So why don't you get into maybe groups of 4 or 5, or however many you want to get together in, what makes sense, and we can kind of finish the night with however long. It's only 8:16. I tried to keep it short tonight, and we can go from there.
Great job,